potluck or politics? Barack Obama says that marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol at a time when pressure's growing to legalize the drug. So, high time for a change or a new low for law and order? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to Inside Story. I'm Adrian Finnegan. He admits to smoking pot as a kid. Now, US President Barack Obama has been speaking out about the effects of marijuana and comparing it to drinking alcohol. His comments come at a sensitive time as the lobby to legalize marijuana in the US gathers pace. Obama told an American magazine, "I don't think it," referring to marijuana, "is more dangerous than alcohol in terms of its impact on the individual consumer." He also noted the racial and economic disparities that exist in the enforcement of marijuana laws. He said, middle-class kids don't get locked up for smoking pot and poor kids do. And African-American kids and Latino kids are more likely to be poor. Obama said the legalization of marijuana in the states of Colorado and Washington would be a challenge, but he went on, "It's important to go forward because it's important for society not to have a situation in which a large portion of people have at one time or another broken the law and only a select few get punished." He added, though, those that argue that legalized marijuana is a panacea and it solves all these social problems, well, I think they're probably overstating the case. Well, marijuana remains illegal in the United States under federal law, but 21 states allow or are about to allow marijuana for medical use. As mentioned by the president, Colorado and Washington have just passed laws to decriminalize the use of marijuana. And in December, Uruguay became the first country in the world to legalize the sale, cultivation and distribution of cannabis. Let's bring in our guests on today's program. In Washington, D.C., we have Dab Riffle, Director of Federal Policies for the Marijuana Policy Project and a former district prosecutor. And joining us via Skype from New York is Jeffrey Reynolds, Executive Director of the Long Island Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Dab Riffle, is the president right when he says that marijuana is no more harmful than alcohol?
He is. By any objective scientific measure, marijuana is less harmful than alcohol. It's less toxic, so it's not associated with the same healthcare consequences. Studies show that the healthcare costs to the user are about 8 times greater for alcohol than they are for marijuana. It's less addictive. About 9% of people who use marijuana become dependent at some point. For alcohol, that figure is 15%. So it is less harmful to the individual user. It's also less harmful to society. Alcohol is linked to about 1/3 of all violent crimes in our culture. It is, without question, linked to violence and reckless behavior, whereas marijuana is not. So there's no question that both to the individual user and to society, marijuana is less harmful than alcohol. And I think as a society, we should treat it that way.
Jeffrey Reynolds, what do you make of that? Can people become dependent upon marijuana in the way that they can with alcohol and nicotine? Is it an addictive drug?
It absolutely is. You know, we provide addiction services out here on Long Island, and our caseloads have just exploded, not only related to opiates and prescription drugs and heroin, but related to marijuana. And in part, that comes from the mindset that marijuana is not dangerous. You know, when the president says that marijuana isn't as dangerous as alcohol, it's like saying that rattlesnakes aren't as dangerous as cobras. They're both dangerous, and they both pose significant health consequences, not only for the individual, but for the public at large. So I really worry about the direction we're headed in on this issue.
Dab Riffle, alcohol, there's no doubt, is responsible for so many social and health problems. Is it right, is it morally right for society to tolerate the open sale of another substance that's designed, let's face it, to alter mental states, to get people high?
Well, you know, again, the scientific fact of the matter is that marijuana is less harmful than alcohol. So to just say that they're both harmful and in the conversation there is ludicrous. I mean, obviously, all drugs are harmful, but they carry very different costs and very different risks, and we should treat them that way. We can't treat all drugs the same, otherwise we'd wind up with the same penalties for heroin and for cigarettes, and that obviously doesn't make any sense at all. Marijuana is less harmful than alcohol, and so if we have laws as a society that say alcohol is legal, and if you watch a football game on Sunday, you're going to be saturated with ads, Anywhere you go in our society, you can legally purchase alcohol, but marijuana is illegal, and we're going to leave that trade underground and in the hands of criminals and drug cartels. And if we find you in possession of marijuana, you can be arrested and prosecuted. Then obviously people are going to choose to use alcohol, and that doesn't make any sense. Why would we steer people towards the more harmful drug?
Jeffrey Reynolds, give us an idea then from your experience about the harm that marijuana does to families and individuals. Does it ruin people's lives?
Yeah, look, there is this perception out there, and the president has, in essence, sent a clear message to young people. Ignore what your parents have told you about marijuana. It's not all that dangerous, and there's nothing to worry about. The lobbyists on the other side of this issue really, have aligned themselves with big marijuana the same way we heard, 30 years ago about big tobacco. And, now we're cleaning up the mess. And it's addiction centers like ours that are left to deal with the damage of discussions like these and policy conversations like these. There's two things that I would say, and there's one area in which the president and probably your other panelists and I agree, and that is our criminal justice response to marijuana has been wholly inappropriate and wasteful. Having said that, it doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just say, let's legalize it, let's give up and let the chips fall where they may. Alcohol costs this country $235 billion per year in healthcare costs, treatment costs, lost productivity, and everything else. As we think about the future of America and getting our kids a better education, becoming more competitive, I look at this and say, every time we get a gain on something, every time we're able to reduce tobacco use or reduce driving fatalities, we then take a step backwards and sabotage ourselves and introduce yet another intoxicant into the marketplace to impact our kids. This is a huge mistake at exactly the wrong time.
Dan, what would you say to that?
I have to say, no one is suggesting that marijuana is harmless or that there aren't going to be consequences associated with legalization or that there are no risks at all associated with the drug. Of course it is. It's a drug. But what we're saying is we can better manage the risks of that drug through taxation and regulation than we can through a system that your other guest admits has failed. We can't address drug use with the criminal justice system. We can't arrest and prosecute 750,000 people every year for a drug that half of Americans use and about 10% use regularly. Again, your other guests and I agree that the criminal justice system has failed, so then we have a choice to make. We can either leave people to obtain marijuana from the underground market. The choice becomes, where are people going to get marijuana? It can be the underground market. It can be in the hands of criminals. It can be in the hands of murderous drug cartels in Mexico that have claimed 60,000 lives. Or we can do what we did with alcohol. We could say prohibition has failed. All we've done is enrich criminals. So let's put this industry in the hands of tax-paying, law-abiding businesses. Let's derive some revenue from this. Let's use some of that revenue to offset some of the costs associated with legalization to provide treatment and addiction services where necessary. But let's put this industry in the hands of licensed, tax-paying, law-abiding businesses that regulate their product, that check IDs, that obey other regulations, whose advertisings we can restrict responsibly. And let's manage these risks responsibly rather than arresting and prosecuting people, with the effect being that marijuana is just more potent, more available, and cheaper than it's ever been.
Jeffrey.
Yeah, look, Dan is a paid lobbyist. He's being paid by Soros and company to forward a message. This is not an either-or situation.
I get no money from George Soros.
This is one of those scenarios where there is a way out, and that is responsible law enforcement. It's alternatives to incarceration. It's treatment on demand. And, whenever I hear about the windfall that comes with taxing marijuana, I kind of have to laugh, although, alcohol tax rates vary state to state. Here in New York State, for every dollar we get in alcohol tax revenue, we're spending $10 to clean up the mess. When I look at what
because alcohol is 10 times as dangerous as marijuana.
Let me just finish. When I look at what we were promised, the lottery was going to fund our education programs here in New York State. That hasn't happened. The reality is communities across the country are going to be forced to deal with this, and families are going to be forced to deal with this. And quite frankly, the experiences so far haven't been good. When you simply mention to folks medical marijuana in California, it is a joke. When you look at what's happened in Colorado with medical marijuana, a 200% increase in ER visits for children under the age of 5 who ate marijuana and wound up in the ER, a doubling of car crashes that involve marijuana. Look, law enforcement across the country has no way of measuring someone's current level of impairment when they're operating a motor vehicle after smoking a joint. This is dangerous stuff. And the folks on the other side have said, look, the war on drugs has failed. We ought to throw it away and start over. big mistake when it comes to dealing with families and young people.
Jeffrey, I want to nail this point. Where do you stand on this issue of are you against decriminalization of marijuana as well as the legalization of it?
Look, I think there's two different things. I think we can reshape the criminal justice system, and quite frankly, one of the big tragedies and the Achilles heel for guys like me is that you look at this and say, look, our experience with locking up mostly minority kids for low-level marijuana possessions has not been successful. It's been an incredible waste, not only of taxpayer money, but of lives. That doesn't mean, though, that we legalize it and turn it into a free-for-all. It means that we can revamp those penalties, ensure that folks are driven into psychoeducational programs set up across the community, treatment where it's necessary, and make sure that we have a public health response to what I consider to be a public health problem.
Gentlemen, I just want to pause for a moment because we've introduced these terms, legalization and decriminalization, and it may well be worth explaining the difference between the two. Well, decriminalizing marijuana would see offences managed by issuing fines or other civil penalties. There are no criminal arrests or charges in the case of decriminalization. Then there's legalizing the drug. Now, in this case, using marijuana wouldn't be a criminal offence at all, but it would be regulated like alcohol and tobacco are at the moment, possibly with a few more restrictions. Well, there's no doubt that attitudes towards marijuana are changing all over the world. A Gallup poll last October found that for the first time, a majority of Americans, some 58%, favoured the legalization of cannabis. Some 39% said that it should remain illegal. Now, that's a huge swing from when Gallup first asked that question back in 1969 at the height of the flower power era. Back then, only 12% of those asked said that marijuana should be legalized. Jeffrey, with 58% of Americans believing that marijuana should be legalized, it appears that you're in the minority. What do you think lies behind that change in public attitudes to the drug? And are you concerned that Americans are pushing to legalize something that at some future point, as you've argued, we find has harmed the health and mental well-being of a generation?
Yeah, look, I am concerned. I don't mind being the minority. It's a frequent position for me, so it's all good. Look, I think there's a lot of money behind this, and there's a lot of momentum behind this. I think, as I said earlier, I think the perception, and it's not an inaccurate one, is that the war on drugs has not been successful. And it's been driven by criminal justice needs. And I think there's a lot of truth there. I worry, though, that we're going too far. And I think some folks have kind of looked at this and said, this is a huge money-making opportunity, not only for private enterprise, but for government that is starved for revenues at this point in time and, quite frankly, tired of regulating things. So, I think the stars have aligned for some changes here. I think our goal as a small community-based nonprofit is to make sure that young people that do get caught up in this understand the facts about marijuana, understand the public health consequences, and understand the need to make our community safer. For us, this isn't an ideological conversation. When I wrap up here, I'm going to meet with families whose kids are not performing well in school, who are getting jammed up with the criminal justice system, and who are sitting there saying, look, I have depression and anxiety, and pot makes that all go away, and I don't know how to stop. So for us, this fight continues regardless of what happens with public opinion. And my hope is that, we don't create another public health disaster down the line where we look back and say, what on God's earth were we thinking?
Dan, what do you think about that? It's true, isn't it, that young people in particular should be learning to process their emotions, not to suppress them or seek to sublimate them. Cannabis, of course, gives people a way to duck out of real life and responsibilities. Do you agree that the legalization of marijuana could lead to a generation of people who've developed no coping mechanism, no self-soothing skills? It will lead to an epidemic of anxiety and panic disorders.
Hearing what your guest has said about my position and why people support taxing and regulating marijuana, I work for a small nonprofit as well, and my background is as a prosecuting attorney. I'm not pro-marijuana or pro any other drug. I'm not in this fight to make it easier for me or anybody else to get stoned. That's not the point of this. The point of this is that there are smarter ways for us to control marijuana and to manage the risks associated with marijuana. Your other guests, and you have talked about, for example, teens and the effect on teens. Well, we were very concerned about teen cigarette use in the 70s and 80s, and so we started using honest science-based education, heavy taxes on cigarettes, and smart regulations on who, where, when, and how cigarettes could be sold. And the result is, here in the United States, we've reduced teen cigarette use to the lowest levels ever, unheard of levels, an unprecedented public health success story. And so there's no reason that we can't use those same tools, honest science-based education, like the fact that marijuana is less harmful than alcohol but does pose some risks, and heavy taxes on its sale, and sensible regulations about who can sell marijuana, when, where, and how it can be sold. There's no reason to believe that the same tools that used to reduce teen cigarette use that have been quite successful lately in reducing teen alcohol use can also be successful in reducing teen marijuana use, while at the same time taking an industry out of the hands of criminals and drug cartels and putting it in the hands, again, of tax-paying, licensed, law-abiding businesses.
Jeffrey, I mean, there is a point there, isn't there, that the teenagers will always rebel. They'll always try to take risks and push boundaries. At least if we legalize the sale of marijuana, we put an age limit on it, then it drives the pushers out of business. It keeps kids away from those street dealers who may well be pushing other drugs, not just marijuana.
Yeah, so the revisionism here, I think, is pretty amazing. What happened was Big Tobacco and their lobbyists lied to us about the potential health consequences associated with tobacco. We had to sue them as a country in order to properly fund the prevention and treatment alternatives that have successfully reduced smoking. So it wasn't a matter of taxation or that kind of thing. We were lied to, and we needed to sue in order to balance our budgets and be able to properly fund prevention and treatment initiatives. In this case, when it comes to alcohol, the control of alcohol has not been very successful. In fact, if you ask 87% of kids under the age of 14 whether or not they've consumed alcohol, they've said yes. 30% of high school seniors say that they binge drink on a regular basis, meaning more than 5 drinks in one sitting. And so our efforts to control alcohol have not worked particularly well. Our efforts to control tobacco did not work until kids figured out that it was unhealthy for them. When we look at marijuana, the same amount of carcinogens, if not more, exist in unfiltered marijuana smoke. And here we're sending a message to young people to say, look, even the president of the United States doesn't think it's a big deal. Baby boomer parents are frequently reluctant to have these conversations with their kids, largely because they've got their own history of using marijuana. Their number one concern is their kid's going to say, well, didn't you do it? Instead, the president has now had that conversation. And I worry about the impact when it comes to the community, young people who are already suffering multiple challenges, and quite frankly, communities that are suffering multiple challenges. I know which communities the legalization of marijuana is going to hit the hardest. And I can guarantee you that a pot shop is not going to open on my corner. It's going to be in the minority neighborhood 3 blocks over. These communities don't need another challenge, don't need another layer of oppression put on top of them.
Dan, you spoke about taking the marijuana, cultivation and sale of marijuana away from the criminals and the tax revenue, huge amounts of tax revenue that could be generated by the legal sale of cannabis. But do you agree that legalization could lead to a surge in use and therefore place an intolerable burden on people and organizations such as the one that Jeffrey represents, who treat substance abusers?
You've been able to walk into a coffee shop in the Netherlands and buy marijuana for years, and yet teen use rates are actually lower in the Netherlands than they are here in the United States. Portugal decriminalized all drugs several years ago. Teen use rates are lower there than they are here in the United States. Even within the United States, when you look at similar jurisdictions with different laws, and so, for example, in New England, Maine has decriminalized several ounces of marijuana, actually, much more than what's allowed in Colorado and Washington, and yet teen use rates are lower there than they are in New Hampshire, which has strict criminal penalties for possession of marijuana. In the South, Mississippi decriminalized marijuana back in the 70s, and yet teen use rates are actually lower there than they are in neighboring Alabama, which has strict criminal penalties. Kids don't go to the law library and look at the criminal code book to get their social cues. They get them from their parents and they get them from their peers. So the responsibility falls not on cops. Cops are not parents. Parents are parents. And it falls on our parents, fathers and mothers, to talk to their kids honestly about the harms associated with marijuana. And it's interesting, your other guest, brought up lies about the relative harms of certain drugs. I mean, that's basically what we've been subjected to, is 70 years of reefer madness and more of it here today, about how marijuana is, the devil weed and it's going to wreck society. The fact of the matter is, again, marijuana is objectively less harmful than alcohol by any measure. To the extent, again, that there are risks associated with marijuana, just as there are risks associated with alcohol, the answer is not to make it illegal. We learned that lesson once already with alcohol. We had a disastrous public policy failure where we enriched criminals and gangs and cartels, and we're doing the same thing again with marijuana. The answer is to tax and sensibly regulate that substance and manage the risks through public health rather than through the criminal justice system.
And Jeffrey, what about the argument that the legalization of marijuana will lead to a decrease in crime and the causes of crime? Certainly the cost of crime in terms of the man-hours required and wasted, it could be argued, to process those charged with possession through the legal system, a pretty minor misdemeanor.
Yeah. Look, I agree. If we throw up our hands and say, let's just legalize it, and some people will get jammed up and other people will be able to get high on a regular basis, yeah, at the end of the day, we're going to save those criminal justice costs. What we lose, though, I think can be measured in terms of the number of young people who become addicted. 1 in 6 adolescents who smoke marijuana will go on to become addicted. 1 in 10 adults will go on to become addicted. No one has called this reefer madness or devil weed. Our point really is, so what's the risk-benefit calculation here? And the benefit is that people can go get high the same way they can drink a beer. The risk is, you're a 13-year-old kid getting turned on to marijuana and winding up addicted. You're a 13-year-old kid developing mental health symptomology because of their marijuana use. Your dad sitting at a stoplight. Let me just finish. Your dad being seated at a stoplight while a driver who's high on marijuana careens through the intersection and takes you out. Those are the potential health consequences, and I think the benefits are not there. The benefits around decriminalization and a different criminal justice system response that's more focused on public health, amen, 100%, 110%, I'm with you. But simply throwing up our hands and say, look, we tried to regulate it, we just can't do it, let's everyone get high, is a cop-out.
Dan.
The reason that we want to regulate and tax marijuana is not to make it more available. Again, it's to manage the risks associated with marijuana. This notion that somehow kids are going to be harmed by this because kids are now suddenly going to be able to get their hands on marijuana is ludicrous. If you want to define marijuana in this society, the first place let me finish, sir. The first place you would look is a high school. Studies show that 80 to 90% of high school students say that marijuana is easy or very easy for them to obtain in their high schools, and usually from drug dealers, as you mentioned, who have access to other harder drugs. So what we're doing isn't working. Marijuana is universally available. It's more available in high schools than anywhere else in our society. So our policy has failed. It has failed, and it's time for a smarter approach. And I can tell you, as a former prosecuting attorney, as somebody who handled several marijuana cases, yeah, there are better things for our law enforcement officers to do. When you look at the clearance rates for rape, for murder, for assault, for aggravated assault, for robbery, for burglary, they're all below 50%. And so there really are real crimes with real victims and real threats to public safety out there that our law enforcement officers could be focusing on instead of arresting and prosecuting people for marijuana.
We're very tight for time. Jeffrey.
Yeah, look, I understand Dan is a pot lobbyist who's being paid to convey a message. I'm an addiction specialist working in the community, really concerned about the impact that this debate is happening on our kids and our families. This is a potential threat to public health, and I think as we move forward with the conversation, we've got to make sure that we got kids, families, communities in mind.
Dan, I know you want to come back. Unfortunately, I can't throw it back your way because we're out of time. The news waits for no man. A very interesting discussion, though, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for being with us. Dan Riffle in Washington, D.C., and Jeffrey Reynolds via Skype from New York. And don't forget, you can find this edition of Inside Story and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows at Inside Story if you want to watch again. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. Thanks for watching. From all of the team here at Inside Story, bye for now.